Well, welcome to 10-Minute Record Reviews, episode 436, and this is the 8th episode in my series Vintage Jazz Bargains. So, what's involved here? Well, the clue is in the title. These are vintage records, so they are either original pressings or very early pressings from the 1950s, 1960s, and 1970s. Secondly, they're jazz records. Now, this can mean a lot of different things, of course, because there are many different styles of jazz, whether it's big band or bebop or hard bop or modal jazz or free jazz or spiritual jazz or what have you, but they're all jazz records. And finally, they're a bargain. Well, what do I mean by that? Well, what I mean is that when I look online on Discogs, I can find at least 3 copies of this record, an early pressing, which are in VG Plus condition or better, and which are also available for $20 US or less. I know the definition of bargain that you have may differ slightly from mine, but that's the definition I'm using. Now, of course, as you know, these videos are free to watch, and once this video is out there in the VC ether, it's very possible that by the time that you go and look for it, some other clever, active, busy bee will have gone there and bought those records, and you may not find them for the same price. But I promise you that when I looked today, these records were available, at least 3 copies for those prices. Okay, those being the rules, let's get on with the records. I'm going to talk about 5 records today as usual, and the first of those is this one, which came out on Coral Records in 1958. It is by Bill Holman, the fabulous Bill Holman. So when people are rude about West Coast jazz, coming from the perspective, say, of listening to Prestige or Blue Note hard bop blowing sessions, Bill Holman might be one of the people that they would criticize. And he, along with people like Shorty Rogers and Lenny Niehaus, would be the archetypes of the emergent homo jazzist West Coastists appearing in the early 1950s. He'd apprenticed in the big bands, he'd played in Stan Kenton's all-white orchestra, and his forte was arranging. And the knock on the kind of music that he or Rogers or Niehaus made when they finally ventured forth as leaders in their own right was that it favored arrangement over spontaneity, and that it sounded prissy compared to the music that was flowing out of East Coast studios. And it is true that Holman favored fuller orchestration in the music that he made, and that he was proud of his reputation as a composer and as an arranger. He's clearly leaning into that image here on the cover, as I guess he's pondering key changes or something while puffing on a dart. But he was also a tremendous musician in his own right, and although he wasn't mimicking the sounds that came out of Blue Note or Prestige or Riverside, it's quite clear from records like this that he was listening to those labels. He has a large band here, something like 15 or 16 musicians, including a number of well-known West Coast players like the tenor player Richie Camuca, the drummer Mel Lewis, the trumpeter Conte Candoli, the alto player Charlie Mariano, and many others. And the music is excellent because, like all truly good arrangers, even if he has a big orchestra at his disposal, he uses the instrumentation sparingly. He never lets a big sound overwhelm the subtle points of the music. And the material is also very good. There are some standards. The record starts with a great cover of Sonny Rollins' Origin, but most of the record is composed by Holman himself. The second side of this record is dominated by a 3-part suite, some 17 minutes in length, I think, called The Big Street. There's some great stuff in there, including some terrific tenor duels. There are quite a number of tenor players in the ensemble, but I have to say my preference is actually for side 1, which swings pretty hard. What you also get is some lovely chromatic ensemble playing of the horns, kind of like you get that horn sound from Woody Herman's band, that whole Four Brothers sound. Anyway, it's unabashedly a big band record, which I wouldn't necessarily recommend, as I'm not the biggest big band guy in the world, but this one I really quite enjoy, so if you see it, try and lay your hands on it. Now, the next record I want to talk about is this one. It comes out on EmArcy in 1955. It's by Herb Geller, who's leading a sextet here, so it's called the Herb Geller Sextette. Now, Herb Geller is an alto player who's probably fair game for the criticism that in the early 1950s, anybody who wasn't Charlie Parker and played alto sax was trying to sound like Charlie Parker. While he always had his own style, his music from the early 1950s is heavily influenced by Parker's approach to bebop. But Geller's playing evolves pretty rapidly in the mid to late 1950s, and I think that has quite a bit to do with the fact that he's playing here with his musical partner and life partner, Lorraine Geller, on piano. She would, of course, sadly pass away a few years after this record was made, but her playing graces this album. She was a swinging and lyrical piano player, and the music that they made together in the mid-1950s and later 1950s before her death saw Geller himself move away from a more frenetic bebop-influenced style to what I find to be a much more pleasing, swinging type of hard bop. Based in Los Angeles, the Gellers themselves were also heavily influenced by another LA musician, the bassist Red Mitchell. Red and Lorraine actually formed a quartet shortly before her death, He plays on 4 of the tracks on here, and the other 4 are played by that master of the walking bass, Leroy Vinnegar. All that to say, this is a great example from 1955 of Herb Geller moving beyond his bebop roots. For the most part, there is still some bebop on here, and towards his more mature style of the late 1950s, which seems strangely unappreciated, economically anyway, on the jazz resale market. Just a word about a couple of other players on here. The brilliant trumpeter Conte Candoli has a couple of star turns, and there's a bit of a mystery man on tenor sax, Ziggy Vines, who, as far as I can tell, only played or only recorded with Herb Geller, but his playing is very nice, so I kind of wonder why it is that his recording catalog is so thin. The record itself is largely mid-tempo swingers. One track to really look out for is his treatment of You'll Be So Nice to Come Home To. Now, the most famous version of that is by Herb Geller's West Coast contemporary, Art Pepper. This version takes a really different approach. Now, the last 3 records that I'm going to talk about are all jazz trio records, and the first of those is this record from 1965. Actually, my version's a Japanese press from later on, but the original version came out on World Pacific in 1965. It's Spunky by Monty Alexander. Now, if you're not that familiar with Monty Alexander, that's probably to be expected because he came to prominence only really in the later 1960s when modern jazz was starting to be swamped by other art forms. Funnily enough, one of the very earliest jazz records I can ever remember listening to, along with Dave Brubeck's Time Out and Get Gilberto, is a record by Monty Alexander called Here Comes the Sun, which I think came out in 1971. That's a great record. This one is probably even better. It's his second record for Pacific, World Pacific as they were by now. It comes out in 1965. The previous year he'd put out a record called Alexander the Great, which was a live record on World Pacific. I guess that title gave him a bit of a hill to climb. But in any event, his is a very interesting style and a bit of a different story. He's from Jamaica, which is not an origin point for a lot of jazz musicians. And you can certainly hear the influences of Jamaica on this particular record. In fact, there's an out-and-out calypso song on here. But he's also clearly been listening to Oscar Peterson and Quincy Jones. He has a slightly busy, quite virtuosic style, which I guess accounts for the Peterson reference. But to my ear, he swings a lot harder than Peterson. And there are a whole bunch of what you might call mid-60s swinging London go-go boots vibes on here, kind of Austin Powers vibes. Some really infectious music, which has a real through line back to Quincy Jones' work. The production on this is gorgeous. It's got a great bottom end, which helps because it features the bass playing of a guy called Victor Gaskin, who was a real regular by this point with Pacific Jazz. He played on some Crusaders records, Jazz Crusaders as they were then. He'd also played with Les McCann before he enters Monty Alexander's orbit for a couple of records. There are also 2 tracks on here which are made in New York, and there Alexander plays with a different cast of musicians, including the bass player Bob Cranshaw. Anyway, I really dig this record. It's one of those records which you can comfortably listen to all the way through and enjoy the variety and just how every track works together. It has a playful feel to it, and it will probably lead you to look for more Monty Alexander records. Now, the second last record and the second of the 3 piano trio records I want to talk about is this one. It comes out on Prestige in 1965. It's by Roger Kellaway, leading a trio, the Roger Kellaway Trio. Now, Roger Kellaway is a contemporary of Monty Alexander. I guess he's a couple years older, a few years older. They both came to prominence in the mid-1960s, but Kellaway takes a bit of a different route. Alexander was largely unknown when he comes in from Jamaica and is signed by Dick Bach and makes these records. Kellaway, by contrast, had actually been quite involved in the studio for a number of years before he embarks on his own as a leader. He'd already amassed more than a dozen recording credits, and that speaks to his versatility, often a great attribute as a sideman, and his versatility and his interest, almost cerebral at times, in trying out different things really characterizes the music on here as well. And maybe the best example of that, I won't say it's the best track on the record, but it certainly isn't one that you're going to forget, is a tune called Brats. Clearly, Prestige was feeling a bit anxious about including this track on the record because about half the liner notes on the back are given over to rationalizing its inclusion. It's played on something called a prepared piano, which was an innovation by the sound pioneer John Cage, who would tie or attach certain things to the piano strings, and Kellaway follows suit using, it says here, washers, nuts, bolts, and wooden pegs. Needless to say, you get lots of sounds out of that. Mostly pleasing, some interesting. I also kind of amused myself imagining somebody in Wisconsin buying this record, seeing a track called Brats and thinking it was about sausages. But anyway, I digress. That track is a bit of an oddity, but there is lots of beautiful music on here as well. The first two tracks on here are actually written by Kellaway's wife, and the first of those, the lead-off track, Organ Morgan, for me is a wonderful piece of funky jazz. But for me, I think the most memorable track on here is a lovely 6-minute treatment of the Beatles' I'll Follow the Sun. The liner notes say that he came across the tune by accident. I don't quite know how you came across a Beatles tune by accident in 1965. Anyway, let's take him at his word. This is a terrific record, and I encourage you to pick it up. The last record I have here, again, a piano trio record, I'm kind of amazed it doesn't fetch higher prices on the resale market. It's by, as you can probably tell, Wynton Kelly. It's called Wynton Kelly. It comes out on VJ in 1961. The reason it is available more cheaply than it probably ought to be may have something to do with the fact that it's on a much lesser known label, VJ. Or it could have something to do with the fact that Wynton Kelly, while a tremendous jazz musician, is probably someone you would say is kind of in the second tier of well-known jazz musicians, not the very top rank. Not that that's fair, because the lineup, including Kelly, is truly excellent. It's essentially Miles Davis's rhythm section from the late 1950s and early 1960s. Wynton Kelly on piano, Paul Chambers on bass, and Jimmy Cobb on drums. Again, that's the rhythm section for that great sextet, which also included not just Miles, but John Coltrane and Cannonball Adderley. But when this record is made in 1961, the band in which these guys were playing, Miles's band, the whole musical context was changing rapidly. Miles had been looking to do something different. When he'd replaced Red Garland, he'd actually brought Bill Evans in first. He really wanted Bill Evans going forward, but Evans didn't want to stay, so Wynton Kelly kind of comes in as second choice. And it would have been hard for Wynton Kelly to replace Bill Evans because Bill Evans is who he is, and Kelly is a much more blues-based kind of swinging piano player. Not that Bill Evans doesn't swing, but you know what I mean. So that relationship between Kelly and Davis was probably never going to last, but it's actually the departure of John Coltrane in the spring of 1960 that really precipitates the eventual breakup of that version of Miles's group. Miles was kind of caught between two stools. On the one hand, he was reacting against the aggressive avant-garde jazz of people like Ornette Coleman, but on the other hand, he realized that he was being left behind by developments in jazz, which was kind of unusual for Miles. And he had a group after Coltrane left that really wasn't up to tackling that new challenge, because Kelly and Cobb and Chambers were all much more comfortable playing blues-based bop. That was also true of the tenor players that Miles auditioned and brought in to replace Coltrane one after the other. The longest lasting one of those was Hank Mobley, and it was with Hank Mobley that these guys and Miles made Someday My Prince Will Come just a few months before they made this record in the spring of 1961. That was one of the later actions of that version of Miles's band. Miles wanted to go in a different musical direction that would eventually take him to his second great quintet with Wayne Shorter. And Kelly, Chambers, and Cobb had their own musical lane they wanted to explore. They'd actually been making music together separately, recording, since the late 1950s. They made a series of records for VJ, of which this is one, and then by 1962-63 they moved on to Verve Records. And what this is on this record, it's a tremendous record by the way, is a kind of swinging, popular, blues-based bop which Miles was now happy to move past, but which these guys really loved to play, and which sold very well. These guys were still part of Miles's group when they made this, but they left pretty soon afterwards as a standalone trio. Paul Chambers actually is only on 5 of the 8 tracks here. Sam Jones, another great swinging bassist, comes in for the other 3. And the program includes 2 very appealing originals, Joe's Avenue and Sassy. And of the standards, I have to say this is the most palatable version of a song I really don't like very much, Sorry with a Fringe on Top, that I think I own. They actually do a really nice version of it. It's much more slowed down. And I would also say that Kelly's version of Autumn Leaves, it's really interesting to compare that with Evans's own version, just in terms of what it was that Miles saw in the playing of the 2 piano players. So there we are, 5 records, under $20, which I think are pretty darn good. I hope you enjoyed this video. Please, of course, leave your own comments below, and thanks very much for watching. We'll see you next time.